Hello and welcome to our Key Stage 3 English webinar. I'm Kathy Martin, the Commissioning Editor for English at Collins, and today it's my great pleasure to introduce our three speakers, Joanne Benjamin-Lewis, Djamila Boothman and Jo Heathcote, who are going to be talking this afternoon about why representation in the curriculum matters. So Joanne Benjamin-Lewis is a former school leader, Ofsted inspector, education consultant and head of English. Now a teacher trainer for Teach First, Joanne chairs the organisation's BAME affinity group, taking part in many diversity and inclusion projects, including the Missing Pages campaign. She's a mother, wife and carer for her elderly mother. As a regular speaker on the BBC Radio Current Affairs programmes, Joanne cares passionately about giving those who are marginalised a space to tell their stories. And as a public governor for Birmingham NHS Trust, Joanne also works to keep disparities around health and race at the top of the agenda. Djamila Boothman is an assistant head teacher, Teach First ambassador, mother, documentary maker and proud British Caribbean. Practicing the mantra, "You cannot be what you cannot see," Djamila is committed to improving cultural representation in the curriculum to promote pride, increase attainment and place equal value on the lived experiences of all children in Britain's classrooms. And finally, Jo Heathcote is an experienced English teacher in Manchester, the principal for an examination board and the writer of numerous textbooks, resources and study guides for educational publishers, many of which we're lucky enough to publish. Jo is a firm believer in a rich, varied and challenging English curriculum that's inclusive of the experiences and the heritages of all her students. So our panel discussion will take around 45 minutes and then we'll have time for a Q&A to take us till 5 p.m. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat at any point and the panelists will answer them at the end or as they go. So just to let you know, this webinar is being recorded and you'll be sent a link to the recording after the event. Also, everyone who's here today will be entered into a prize draw to win a copy of the Who We Are anthology for their school. I'll now hand over to Jo and I hope you all enjoy what promises to be a wonderful session.
Hi, thank you very much, Kathy, and thanks for inviting me along today. It's a pleasure to be here and talking about the campaign, the Missing Pages campaign, and also talking about our new publication and what we've been working on over probably about 12 months, I think now, isn't it, Djamila and Joanne, for just thinking about our publications that began as one publication and has now developed into two. More about that later and might even develop into three, you never know. We're finding that we are filling Missing Pages really quite rapidly once we get started, which I think is a real measure of the passion of the project. I know that we're talking today a little bit about curriculum. I know that's sort of what Kathy's asked me to maybe address first of all. And I think it's really important maybe when we're thinking about English curriculum to just differentiate between the words curriculum and exam specification, because I think we can get quite caught up as teachers in the demands of exam specification and forget actually that the curriculum is much bigger and much broader than that and lasts for much longer than a GCSE course. So when we're thinking about some of those statistics that came out of the work at Teach First and particularly Joanne's work on Missing Pages, which is how we came to know each other and become involved in this project. I think those statistics that 75% of English teachers had concerns and that 98% felt it was important to have diverse texts and authors within the curriculum. They're really telling in the sense that we think, well, hang on a minute, if we're all so concerned about it, well, what are we actually doing about it? What are we doing about it on a day-to-day level? I think it's worth bearing in mind that the exam specifications only cover us for year 10 and 11 at GCSE and obviously sixth form. But the Key Stage 3 really is a an open doorway in terms of our curriculum and in terms of our curriculum planning, to be able to really address those concerns and to really diversify our curriculum through Key Stage 3. We've really got an open door as English teachers to study whatever class readers we want, to study whatever poetry we want, whatever non-fiction we want. And I think that's where we began, really, was looking at Key Stage 3 when we developed Who We Are, was to start to actually make it accessible to find some text and think about the kinds of activities we do. But it's no different to working with any other text, is it? We're still going to do the same kinds of activities. We're still going to stimulate reading activities and stimulate analysis and do some speaking and listening and do some great creative writing. All of those things are at our fingertips, and Key Stage 3 is a totally open door. I think sometimes when we think about GCSE, again, I think we get a little bit caught up with literature, and we kind of like, oh, we've got to do Shakespeare, we've got to do, we might have to do Dickens, or we've got to do the 19th century novel. And we've got all the usual old famous white guys in there that we've all been teaching forever. But we forget a little bit maybe about English language, and that absolutely every aspect of English language works with unseen texts. And so again, that gives us a massive opportunity to introduce our students to some really challenging texts, some really interesting texts, some really diverse authors. And that even within the literature specification, we've got unseen poetry as well. So I think certainly that's been in our minds when we've been creating the resources. It is that kind of opportunity. Would you agree, Joanne?
Yes, most definitely. I think you'll both remember the number of hours that we spent looking at possible submissions to the Key Stage 3 text, Who We Are. And that, I think, really opened all of our eyes to the absolute wealth of material that's out there. It's just that often teachers will stick to what they know, and that's understandable with the pressures that there are in the classroom. But also you think about, the good old stock cupboard, what texts are in there that you can use, because budgets are a huge constraint. And I think that's what has been really, just kind of really illuminating and just so positive about our experience, is that there is a massive wealth of resources out there. It took us a very long time to to agree on which 24 texts to include. It was almost, fists we were fisticuffs almost about which ones we wanted to include. It was brilliant that there was just so much. And I know that some of the attendees today, they are teachers, and they may be thinking, I'm not sure where to go in order to get support. I know a couple of poems, maybe, perhaps I've read some text, but I'm not sure what to do with them. So that was the main reason for our text, was to provide support and kind of scaffold around that. And also, if people go to Teach First missing pages if you just put that in any Google or any search engine, you will also find resources there, as well as webinars. So you will have practicing teachers talking about a scheme of work, a diverse book that they have used within their classrooms, and the best way to approach it, just to build confidence around texts that sometimes people are unfamiliar with.
That's a really good point, Joanne. And I think it is that thing about finding materials. And we were just kind of chatting before the webinar started tonight. And I was just kind of reminded that we love going in bookshops as English teachers. We love browsing in bookshops. It's like our favourite hobby. And so certainly, we're kind of all, as well as being English teachers, we're all parents as well, I think, on this call. And we were saying beforehand, like, I've got a 12-year-old at home, and just before the webinar started, I just had a cursory glance through her bookshelf at the moment. I'm lucky she's a really avid reader. Now, I've got a huge pile here of things that she's bought really recently, age 12, year 8, that she's absolutely loving reading. And they're all the ones that are by a diverse collection of authors. So the material is out there. And I think anybody who's watching, kind of next time you're in a big bookstore or an independent bookstore, have a look at some of the young adult fiction and just think, oh, is there maybe one there that we could introduce into our curriculum? Is there a new class reader that will be exciting for next year? Because that's something that we found really, that there's so much out there once you start looking. So many brilliant authors of young adult fiction for class readers for Key Stage 3, I think, at the moment. Obviously, we've been working on this project together, along with Mike Gould and Lindsay Skinner, but certainly when we were working at Teach First together, Joanne and I were working on a project together last year. It was really brilliant that one of the mentors that I was working with, who's now training to be an English teacher, was Ali Al-Jamri. And Ali was one of the mentors that I was working with, who is also a performance poet. And we brought him into this project, and he works with a poetry collective in Manchester called Young Identity, that's run by the poet Shirley May. And brought with him just such an opening into a world of new young performance poets, and that must be happening across the UK. That's just not happening just down the road from me in Manchester. That's not just luck, you know. And so it was just amazing to have that collection of new voices and new writing, that we could include it in both anthologies. So, I mean, Djamila, how important was that for us to get those new voices?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I mean, today I'm going to begin by kind of talking about why it's really, really important that we focus on representation being celebratory and positive, because I think it's kind of that thing. We're just in November now, coming out of Black History Month, and I know that that's always a month where there's a lot of conversation around Black history. And I think in 2021, you know, the year where we've got the first Black Afro hair advert out on TV, I do think it's really important that we are having discussions about what is going into the curriculum. I think that when schools are considering the curriculum intent for English, one would hope that it does link to that school's overall vision, and within that you're hoping to see a promotion of equality and diversity, and a real commitment to providing or promoting cultural competence across the school curriculum, across the school environment and the school community. So those questions about how do you develop cultural competence within your school? What is the culture of your school? Are all of the members of your community, not just the staff, but the students, the parents, the carers, are they involved in decisions? Is it collaborative? Are you demonstrating that the lived experiences of everybody who forms your school and your school identity, are they being taken on board? And I think the curriculum is one of the most important parts of that. And a lot of the time in the past, people haven't necessarily discussed the curriculum in the same way. But I think where we're at now, whenever a school is claiming to be inclusive, we need to be looking at their curriculums. And I think the English curriculum is definitely a very, very good place to start, because I don't think it's good enough. It's simply not good enough for us to say, well, actually, students do get to read about a Black person, and they do get to read about a disabled person because they read about crooks in Mice and Men. Well, we won't go down that road too much, but anybody who knows about the character crooks in Mice and Men will know why actually that is almost damaging, I think, when you're thinking about what your texts are and including different groups into that. I think any English teacher who maybe has taught a poem like Maniza Alvi's Presents from My Aunts in Pakistan will know how important it is that actually the tone is celebratory, the tone is building kind of pride for those students who can say, this is my culture, this is who I am. And, you know, there is a huge amount of power in that. I think also if you think about what a classroom looks like, and you think about sometimes those children who maybe don't speak so much, they might not speak English as a first language, they might not feel particularly inspired in the classroom. I think when you start injecting texts that represent them, that allow them to be the master in the classroom and say, oh yeah, that's my nan, you know, oh yeah, that was us on Sunday. Actually, you completely change the narrative in that classroom, and you make those young people feel seen, and you make them feel heard. And while empowering them is hugely important, I think the other side of that is about education, because actually school is that place where young people get to be educated. And for those children who haven't had that exposure, you know, one of my favorite lessons in the anthology is the one on the boy in the top knot, because I think about my school where we don't have many Sikh students. In fact, I can think of one Sikh student who does have a top knot, and actually the opportunity to teach that lesson, where actually he's probably only ever sat in a classroom with his peers, maybe for RE, and had a very kind of factual lesson around what is Sikhism.
Yeah.
You don't then get that chance to really let him talk about it and let the people around him understand a little bit more about his experience. So I think it's just such an important thing in terms of validation, empowerment, educating those, and really providing some equality for the people in the room, for everybody in the room, to say, actually, I'm learning something new today. This isn't something that my parents have taught me about. This isn't something that I've learned. And I think you said earlier, Jo, when we're thinking about English, we think about literature, and we also think about language. And I think young people, they're always really quite good at literature because they read those texts and they know those texts and they know those quotes. But actually, in terms of really developing their ability to analyze texts, this is the perfect opportunity for it, because they're reading something they've never read before, about something that they may never have read before. And it's kind of political without being political, isn't it? Because it's kind of, it's challenging that thing about where do people belong? Do these people belong in a book? Do these people deserve to be main characters? Should we, you know, and actually completely changes the way that young people think and engage during their English lessons. So I think debunking those myths about who are the main characters, who are the people that, you know, that is really, really important as well.
And who are the writers as well? Like, you can, you know, who can be a writer? Who can be a published writer? Who can be in a classroom as a published writer? That's a really important.
Yeah, I think when we were working on this project, I think some of us felt really strongly that there should be that little box that kind of said, this is the writer, this is who they are, this is what they do, this is what their passions are, find out more about them. Because actually you're completely right, it's about the aspirational element as well, isn't it? When children are in school, it's not that, oh, these are the kids who are good at sport, these are the kids who are good at music, but actually here's some examples of some really successful people who come from where you come from, and this is what they've written about. And I think that last thing that I want to say, because I haven't said it and I'll kick myself if I don't say it, promoting a love of reading. Promoting a love of reading, because actually it's so easy as English teachers to get carried away with the exam, but actually what we really want is to promote a lifelong love of reading. And ultimately the reality is that if we don't provide that variety for young people, what it means is that they read to access what they need to access, but then maybe they don't pick up a book later on. And what we really want to do is be able to allow them to see themselves in the text that they read, and to really feel that they can go to a bookshop, or they can go to a library, or they can type in something online and they can get access to a broad range of things that will mean that they are a lifelong reader. And I think that that's really, really critical as well.
That definitely has to be the goal of all English teachers who could definitely, have that as a badge that you kind of wear all the time, because without that, and just think about all of the amazing opportunities that come from a love of reading, and think about how rich our subject is. So, reading the text that we have provided in terms of the extracts, or just, any diverse text, will link in with geography, will link with history, will link with sociology, with politics, will give them opportunities to understand about not only the UK, but making them really prepared to be global citizens. We have to kind of stop kind of just thinking about, we're getting them ready for the next stage of life. It's bigger than that. It's the whole world. Yeah. We're in a virtual situation, just us here now. Look at that we could actually be in the Caribbean, we could be in Africa, we could be everywhere. And we want our young people to be able to have those nuanced conversations about the cultures and communities that they're going to be conversing with. And they won't be able to do that without any confidence unless they've had an opportunity to be exposed to, whether it be that they've read an extract from a poem, or whether they have read a book, or they've had a conversation about the context of Sikhs in the Black country in the UK, just all those little nuances. And that just makes for so much more kind of rich conversation. Very, very powerful when we can prepare our young people for that kind of level of experience. And not just in schools, because often you hear this argument, well, we don't have any diverse children in this school. All the children are white working class, or they're white middle class. And so, we don't need to read books that have diverse characters. But actually, it's even more important in those schools.
I was just going to say that, Joanne. I think it's even more important.
Even more important. Because what other opportunities are they going to have those conversations? They may not be have a friend in their classroom that comes from another class, culture. What they are sadly going to be reinforced for them in the media are very negative stereotypes and connotations about people from other cultures. There's been a wealth of studies done looking at, how many times other cultures are talked about in the media, and what are those connections. So often Muslims are only talked about in connection with terrorism, or somebody Black will be connected to something which is involving criminality. So you don't get a true picture, a true representation from what we see in the media. But when you have people telling their own stories, the power of that they are telling their story from their point of view, and then that's being read by a young person, that way of just getting to grips with who people are. And that's why I love the title of our collection, Who We Are. It's really key that there is an opportunity for people, wherever they come from, to have that connectedness with others.
Absolutely. The other thing I wanted to mention was also just this idea about, in schools, we're governed by so many things, aren't we? And then we try to make sure that the curriculum fits it. But actually, when we were talking about RSE and relationships and sex education, it's also important that we consider actually the age of young people when they're in school, and this really kind of time, it's a time when they're carving out their identity and they're understanding themselves, and having those positive representations having that opportunity to have those conversations around a text, but actually with a bigger question and a bigger topic. It's just so valuable, because what it does is it allows young people to express themselves in a safe environment with their teacher, with their teaching assistants or their LSA, with their peers, and to really kind of look at the language behind it and think about the connotations of that language as well, which I think is hugely important. And again, it's part of the reason why I think it was so important for all of us when we were selecting those texts and making sure that they were the right choices to kind of promote positivity and understanding around every single group that was represented in those texts.
Yeah, you're right there, Djamila, because it's been important to include some LGBTQ plus writers in the anthology, as well as kind of the cultural makeup as well. That's been sort of really at the forefront of our mind, and we've got some, as you say, some age appropriate but really brilliant writing in there. And sort of just coming back to what Joanne was saying in terms of some of the issues that you can raise. I mean, quite a lot of our texts, I think they're quite challenging, they're quite complex, they deal with some quite difficult issues, but I think the way that we've kind of worked together to scaffold the lessons, they make for safe spaces to discuss some of those issues. I think that's been really at the forefront of everyone's minds, hasn't it? And we've included details on the lesson plans as to any kind of potential sensitivities or things for teachers to be aware of as well when they're teaching those lessons.
I think the lesson plans, even if I say so myself, are really incredibly helpful, very detailed. As you say, they highlight not only sensitivities, but I know for myself, I really wanted to give an opportunity to do some of the things that I wished I had kind of experience of when I was a child. So, for example, I've just been working on a lesson for Akala's natives. And within that, I, chose an extract where he had a really very young, as a young boy, a very difficult situation with his teacher and his mother then wanting to know about how do you complain about an issue with regards to race? What is it that you do? What can you say? Who do you approach? And I just thought, if I'd had an opportunity to even think about that, to role play it, to talk about it, to discuss it with someone when I was younger, that I would have been really empowered at that point. And often we don't get those opportunities. So that's what I think has been really key about the work that we've been doing, is that the activities are really varied. So yes, you may have writing a story or, doing a role play, but yes, there's also lots of opportunities to do different styles of writing. Giving opportunities to plan, thinking about the vocabulary that you use, and then exploring some of the wider context around the piece has been particularly invaluable. So, reading something like Natives and thinking about what was the UK like at the time, what were some of the issues, it does mean that it's a real kind of intersection of lots of different topics and subjects, which then gives for a very, very rich lesson, which would provide lots and lots of resources in terms of being able to talk about many issues.
I think sort of coming back to what Djamila was saying before about that kind of, we want to cultivate that lifelong love of reading as English teachers. I think kind of in the current climate particularly, I think it's also about being able to I personally feel that we live in quite a divisive society in some ways. Kind of you were talking before, Joanne, about the kind of representations that we do see. The representations of someone who's Muslim quite often in the media is represented in a particular way. Certainly, the last school that I was teaching in was all girls and was all Islamic girls, and so they felt that very keenly, and they articulated that, you know, very well, their kind of disappointment and their dismay at representations in the media. So I think any text that we can provide that open up those conversations and give that opportunity to be critical readers and to cut through some of that noise and some of those negative portrayals, I think then can only be a good thing.
I was going to just focus on the kind of impact in terms of students when they actually do see characters that represent them, and also what happens when we don't see that. And I know that this is one of Djamila's favourite phrases, and also mine as well, that it's, you know, it's quite hard to be what you can't see. And I wanted to actually kind of dig into that and find out where that paraphrase or that quote came from. And because we all say it, but it's like, oh, where did that originate from? So Marion Wright Endelman, she's the founder of the Children's Defense Organization in America. So they advocate for young people's rights. She was one of the first people that coined that phrase. And in one of the conferences that she spoke at, she talked about the fact that there actually is a real apartheid of literature. And I thought, actually, that is true, that for many, many years, books just by omission didn't mention anybody who was of color or disabled or had a who was part of an LGBT community. There was no reference to anybody in terms of diverse thinking, characterization, nothing. It was as if they didn't exist. And if there was a mention, as you said, Djamila, it might be as in of mice and men, and there's a mention of crooks, something like that. And then we started to see a change, and I actually particularly remember this change, even at shows how old I am, the beginning of the 80s. I saw that there was beginning to be a change. And I remember reading, do you remember Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry?
I do.
That was one of the first books that I read that had a Black girl as the lead character and had a Black family, a very progressive family, and, you know, who were educators. And the impact for me as a child reading that book, for the very first time having a book that was read as a class reader with all my peers. There was two Black girls, of which I was one of them in my class. Everybody else was white. And the fact that everybody loved the book, we all wanted to find out what was going to happen next. And I then started thinking, well, why have we not been given the opportunity to read books, you know, about other communities? And once that thought had started to develop, it was then I started going to the libraries and starting to dig out and trying to find books. And a local library near me in Aston in Birmingham actually had a Black librarian and an Asian librarian. And as a result, now this shouldn't be the case, but as a result, the books were diverse. And often that's a lot like in schools. And we really do need this to change. That if there is a Black teacher or an Asian teacher, then you might find that there's more diverse text, or the curriculum will speak to a more diverse community. But we need to get to a stage where it doesn't matter whether there is a Black member of staff, an Asian member of staff, that as a matter of course, that all of the staff are going to be thinking about representation, about diversity. And I'm, you know, hoping that, you know, through time, we will begin to see some of those changes. I had a Black English teacher. So I kept thinking about, I wonder how much of an impact that made on me, that I could see somebody that looked like me, who was teaching a subject that I absolutely adored. And even today, we've been having a conversation about that, because Teach First have partnered with the Lewis Hamilton Foundation to support and encourage Black STEM teachers. So we're still at a point at which that level of representation really, really matters. And it goes on, because then you get Black publishing houses, you get Black writers having an opportunity to get their work picked up. Again, in the 90s, I remember there was a publishing house called Express, and they used to write books, very London-based. They were based in Brixton, and they wrote books so that, you know, you could be standing outside Brixton Tube Station and selling books, and that anybody would be interested in reading, that love of reading, so that, you know, you would get a book and it would just absolutely grip you. But it was written in such a way that it spoke to very young, and often we think of boys as being quite difficult to grasp in terms of getting them interested. So they were books that were for them. And so I think that having that level of representation, so it's not just a book that's got a Black character, it goes so much further and broader than that, so that you will then get the George the poets, that you will then have the Lem Sissays, that you will have, you know, people who are writing for a living, and writing is cool, that it's something that people think is not just, you know, resigned to Shakespearean times, that you've got someone like a Carla who takes, you know, the hip hop Shakespeare on tour around the country, so that young people can see that there is something in all of these different types of literature for them. And that's what's powerful about the conversations that we've been having, is that it provides a whole wealth of opportunities. Young people then writing, then acting and directing, you know, it brings about a whole industry of people who can see themselves represented in that work and will want to then develop that further. And there's no stopping that in terms of what it can achieve.
Absolutely agreed. Just while you were talking about that, I just remembered that some of my, before we did all this work, some of my most successful lessons were lessons where I had literally just picked a rapper and I'd just done a song with students, because so many students say, I hate poetry, and I hate poetry, miss. And it's like, no, you don't. And again, it's just that thing about providing that access and opening their minds. And it really is just such a powerful thing. And I just think the anthology is great. I'm not saying that because our names are on it, or the labour that went into it. I'm just saying it because it really is that opportunity, particularly as you were talking about resources, limited resources in schools. Actually, you need one of these books because everything's downloadable and everything's printable, and just try it as a starting block. And then what I've actually done in our school is I've spoken with the head of English, and I've said, you know, if we're going to teach this as a unit, why don't we then just ask every teacher to provide their favourite book? And just an extract from it, and then you can then knock a lesson up based on that. And again, you know, we talk about students and the diversity of the student body, but also staff within a school will add something to that as well. And, you know, particularly in schools where the local community, where you're inviting the local community in, there is such value in just asking, if you're lacking materials, ask parents, you know, bring us in a book, bring us in a poem. You know, when we were actually looking at this, I asked my colleagues, and there were some texts that didn't actually go into the anthology, but like Ilhan Chomak, I think that was a friend of mine, Pinar, who I work with, who had said to me, you know, you've got to get some of this in there. So English teachers are passionate about literature. We know this already. Yeah. I think we're going to questions now, aren't we?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I noticed quite a few, because when you're busy talking, you don't notice how many questions have come up. So I'm not sure if Kathy was planning to introduce the questions.
Yes, I can do. So we've had a couple of interesting comments actually so far. So just talking about your thoughts and reflections. Maisie said, I find the reading book list for Key Stage 3 very generic and not very inspiring. And also that she wishes the Key Stage 3 book list would include some foreign translations. So I just don't know if any of the three of you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, I don't mind chipping in on that one. I think there are Key Stage 3 lists out there and you can download them from the internet, but I think you've got to be mindful that they've probably been there for quite a long time. And certainly, you know, some lists will have been there from when I started teaching. They might not have changed. I've been teaching 24 years, and they might not have changed since then. And we still see the same books on there that maybe were in the stock cupboard. You know, John mentioned the stock cupboard, that were in the stock cupboard when we first started teaching. And so, well, make your own list. Make your own list. Do your own Key Stage 3 list. Let's, you know, we don't have to be hamstrung by what is out there already. Just because somebody's put it on a list doesn't mean it has to stay on a list. And by the same token, I think, you know, certainly, sort of, as I say, when I went into my last school, which was all Islamic girls, when I opened up the stock cupboard, I found there were things in there, you know, the boy in the striped pajamas, and Good Night, Mr. Tom, and Private Peaceful, and, you know, sort of all those kind of things that we think of as being the ubiquitous Key Stage 3 reading texts, all of which are great class readers, but it doesn't mean you can't have something else as well. You know, just because something's on a list doesn't mean that you can't add to the list and diversify the list yourself. So I would say, if you know, if you can't see things on a list, put it on the list. It's not illegal to put something on the Key Stage 3 list. Get stuck in. Don't worry about it. Put on what you'd like to see, what you'd like to read, what you can see in the bookshop, things that you found. Stick it on the list.
Okay, and I think we've got another question just asking about whether poetry is the best place to start when you're thinking about introducing new texts into the curriculum, or do you find it's equally easy to start anywhere?
I think this is where the importance of context comes in, actually. And I think I was having a conversation with some colleagues just the other day, and we were talking about spoken word, which I absolutely love. And she was talking about the fact that none of our teachers have really done it before, and it might be something that people are quite nervous about. But I think you have to know what your students are good at, because I think with students, if you start where they're at, that's always a really, really great way of building bonds and kind of encouraging them to do more. So I know if I were going to devise a Key Stage 3 curriculum in my school, I would probably start with spoken word, because so many of my students are into rap and even drill, which I think is a really good place to start, because you then start bringing in the idea of poetry, but poetry that doesn't have to rhyme, and poetry that's applicable to them, and poetry that allows them to use their own slang before they become comfortable with the idea of poetry, which they think is this really, you know, high academic thing that they can't attain at first. But I think it's really just to probably even just audit what are your students good at, what do your students feel positive about, and maybe start there first, and build up from there. Because once they trust you and they know, oh, Miss is going to like really enhance what I'm already good at, then that's when you then introduce the things that are more challenging for them, because they then know, actually, even if I muck it up the first time, Miss is going to help me and support, Sir is going to help me and support me further. So that's how I would tend to do it.
Fantastic, thank you. I had a question, actually. I was thinking about what Joanne was saying about sort of, you know, almost coming to blows over the text choices in the process. And I just wondered if you sort of had any advice for other teachers having been through that process about what the criteria were that made one text better than another to choose, or what guided your choices there.
I'm not sure that it was about what text was better in that sense. I think when you are passionate about a text, when you're really, really passionate about a text, you find almost all of the selling points which will persuade your colleagues to include that. So of course, we have notions of what we think is a good piece of literature. So we're thinking about, the opportunities to be able to delve in and show young people the style and the form and all of those and the characterization, all of the the typical aspects that you expect, but you want it to be gripping as an extract. And I think that's the thing that really helped us when we were exploring the text was, does it work? Does it work? Can you imagine young people and their teacher reading this and being able to discuss it, being able to find nuances in it, being able to learn from it, being able to reflect on situations that were happening to them and to others? So it's got to be something which you can really get your teeth into, which is something Joe always says. It's got to be something that you can really, really get your teeth into in terms of discussion, opportunities to write about it, to explore. And we want it to be a stepping stone in terms of the Key Stage 3 piece, that it actually sets them up for being able to do some more extensive work at Key Stage 4. So we wanted it to be challenging enough, but also that it gave them the opportunity to really get to grips with it. And I think that was what was powerful. And what was nice is that we all had an opportunity to, kind of have a favorite piece that we championed. And by the end, I think everybody kind of came round to everybody else's way of thinking. So that was good. But towards the end, it got a bit tricky a few times where we were like, what are we going to cut and what are we going to keep? I think we probably could have had about 100 in there easily. Had 100 extracts in there without any trouble at all. But as I say, that just shows the wealth of material that's there. It just takes a kind of a collaboration. So if you're in a department and it's something that you want to be able to do, using a text like what we have, and there are resources online, lots of different sites have resources around the diverse text, then let everybody have a favorite that they bring to the table, that they can then explore and talk about, illustrate different ways in which they would like to see it used in the classroom, so that everybody takes ownership of developing the piece. And I know that some schools are quite prescriptive, that it's like, here's the scheme and this is what you've got to do. But like Joe said, there is lots of freedoms, especially at Key Stage 3, to be able to, put in an example of poetry or an extract from a text, so that your overall scheme becomes more diverse.
Yeah, I would just add to that as well. If you do have the misfortune of working in a school where you're not allowed to change things, remember that there's always going to be one-off days, one-off weeks where you've got Southeast Asian Awareness Week, you've got all kinds of weeks. If you have a look at that calendar, there will definitely be some overworked person in the school who's usually tasked with putting something together for that week. What you can do is you can provide a lesson for that week, whether it's an assembly or a lesson. There are always going to be opportunities to kind of put your mark on kind of developing that cultural competence within your school. And I think the other thing about the fighting, there were actually fisticuffs, was that
like via Zoom.
When you do get to that point, I think the thing to remember, and I think for me personally, one thing I kept on having to remind myself is, it's for the children, it's not for us. So while I might feel really passionate about this book, actually I've read loads of books, but actually providing this one book or this one text for this, if this is the only experience or exposure that a young person has to this particular group of people, it may not be what I want them to be exposed to. I want it to be positive. I want it to be celebratory. I don't want it to be something that brings them down. I don't want it to be something that reinforces a really damaging or limiting viewpoint, because for me as an adult, it's fine, I'm reading it for pleasure, but actually it's about taking that responsibility of, if this is the only exposure that they have to this group of people, is it a positive one? Is it one that's going to make them feel good about that thing? And I think that helps as well, where you're cutting down and making those decisions, and just talk to people. You know, I think I'm usually, because of how I work, I don't usually get the luxury and the pleasure of spending so much time collaborating with other people, and there's huge value in that, because, you know, sometimes we do become possessive about our favorite texts, and we don't even see that actually this might not be the right thing for a 12-year-old child at this point, you know. So I think that's also important.
Just to sort of follow on from that as well, I think just in the ways that we might use the text, and the idea that, you know, maybe there isn't a lot of scope in your existing curriculum, or if you don't have a lot of choices or freedoms within your curriculum. I think what's quite interesting about the fact that we've done these as kind of separate lessons is a way that we can use them in collaboration with other texts, so that, for example, if you are teaching a set text at Key Stage 4, then some of the work that we've been doing on the new anthology is, if you think about them thematically, if you think about texts that are about love, if you think about texts that are about relationships, if you think about texts that are about parents and children, if you think about anything that you're teaching that you have to teach, I think there's plenty in the anthologies that there'll be something there that will be a great supplement to that will allow you to teach sort of an additional lesson that uses a different perspective, a different voice, a different way of looking at it, that you can then supplement what you're teaching already with the lessons that we've got.
I've just seen a message from Maisie. Could we have a list of the books? It's a very long list.
It is very long. Yeah, it's a spreadsheet of about 100 texts, but we'd be happy to share some of
not
those.
The spreadsheet, Kathy, not the spreadsheet.
Oh no, not the spreadsheet.
I think we've got another question, which was just from my colleague Sarah. Have you taught any of the lessons in your school since we published the pack? And if so, we'd love to hear about how your students responded to them.
I have. And actually my students absolutely loved it. I did a lesson on which lesson did I do? I forgot now. I did the lesson where we looked at debating, and it was one of my lessons. I'm trying to remember which one it was. There's one that I did about and it had Chimamanda.
Was it the Darren Chetty lesson?
Darren Chetty. So
yeah.
And we kind of looked at this idea around who appears in stories. So it was actually quite closely linked to why we did this. And I did it with some year 9s who are quite spirited, let's say, and they really enjoyed the opportunity to kind of not only see the video that went along with it, but to think about and to discuss this idea about texts and who's in stories, and it read down really well. I think the thing that they loved about it was that it was a different type of lesson, and as I said, that's one of the things for me on a personal level that I've really enjoyed about doing this, is that working with a team of amazing people has allowed me to kind of think about different ways of teaching as well, which I think it's always so refreshing to work with other people and not only look at what you're teaching but how you're teaching it, because students do really respond to really carefully and well-planned lessons. And I think sometimes that is the danger, isn't it, of having texts that are sitting in the cupboard for a very long time and schemes of work that have sat on the system for a very long time, and all you really do is tweak it based on the ability within the classroom. So having that opportunity to really have a fresh look and start from scratch, for me, I found it really really refreshing for the young people that have benefited from the lesson so far.
Thank you, Djamila. And I don't know, Jo and Joanne perhaps haven't had the opportunity to actually teach with the lessons, but I don't know if there's something you could say about a particular lesson, either your own or somebody else's, that really made an impact on you, and a text that you really liked from the pack.
I think sort of some of the texts that I brought to the table were things that I'd used with my own students and that I knew that they'd enjoyed talking about, and as Joanne says, getting their teeth into as well. So, you know, some of the texts that I knew really worked with students at different ages, and some of the activities that we'd done. It's really nice, I think, sort of in the Key Stage 4 anthology, Kathy, where we're including a poet, Hafsa Bashir, who I did some work on her materials with my own students in Manchester, and was lucky enough that she came to do some work with students as well, that she was a local poet and actually came in. So again, that's one of the joys, I think, of discovering new writers and new voices local to your own communities, is that quite often they are very willing to come and talk to your students as well, which adds a whole different level of enrichment to English teaching. And I know that Hafsa worked with some of my students on some spoken word pieces, as Djamila's mentioned, that became part of Manchester International Festival, and gave those girls a real opportunity to share their voices. And they wrote pieces not just in English, but actually using some of their additional languages and first languages as well within their pieces of work, which, you know, transpired into a really amazing project. So I think there are ideas in there and ideas within the pack that could, you know, provide some real enrichment for some of your students.
I know that we shouldn't say the dreaded O word, but when you think about Ofsted as well, I'm going to say it, guys. When you think about what they say the curriculum should look like as well, I felt really positive when I looked at it, because actually when you think about what they want from the curriculum, they don't just want a kind of tick box thing. They want some real thought and passion to go into these curriculums, because the reality of it is that depending on where your school is, you're holding the cultural competence of your young people in your hands. And where it comes to English and English literature, some of our students will never pick up a book if we don't give it to them. And for me, you know, it's funny, one of my favorite books as a child, I was bought a book by my dad. It was called Ruby by a writer called Rosa Guy.
Oh, I used to love that.
Which I am, you know, my daughter is called Ruby Rosa. That's how much of an impact it had on me. I'm an English teacher, and that's the name of my daughter. So for me, that wasn't an issue. My parents had the money and the awareness to buy me those books, but I meet young people every day who it's just not a priority, or and it can't be for some. And so it really is about that idea that we're not just teaching them to an exam from 11 years old because we're worried about our grades. It's actually about that thing where we know we have a duty to really enhance these young people's passion and ignite that in them, so that they do know that they can pick up a book and they have that confidence to do it and to develop it. I was walking the other day with my daughter across, I live on the other side of the borough that I teach in, and I saw a young man who I remember I was his form tutor when he was in year 7, and he's now in year 13, and he goes to one of the best schools in the borough, and he has 2 crutches, and he did from since he was in primary school, actually. And I thought to myself, and he's Turkish, and I thought to myself, he never would have ever read a book at school that was about anybody who was Turkish or about anybody who had a disability. And as sad as it made me, I thought, but that's not going to happen for any of my students from here on out. And that made me feel positive. And it is that thing about making sure that we're doing right by our young people. So I think it's really, really valuable.
If the 98% all do one thing and introduce one text, imagine the impact.
And amazingly, my daughter is called Maya after Maya Angelou, who was, so we're both kind of mirroring each other there, who was a really key, again, part of my developing understanding of writers of colour, and to read her poetry and to also read her texts, you know, her actual, all of the sort of autobiographies that she wrote had a massive, massive impact on me. I think that is absolutely key to everything that we do. It does have impact. It isn't just about ticking a box. It isn't just playing lip service to what Ofsted might mean. And just think about the fact that we even have within our text non-fiction pieces like David Olusoga's Black and British. So how often would anybody pick up a book like that? You know, you'd think, oh, if I'm going to read a book, it's going to be fiction. But actually, we've got texts in there that speak to other disciplines, other subject areas, and totally change the conversation, because then people think about the fact that actually Black people being present in the UK didn't start with Windrush, that it's been part of the history for centuries. And so giving young people an opportunity to be able to explore that is absolutely, it's just been eye-opening. And I did that particular piece with my own daughter, who's 11, and she just learned so much from that.
Absolutely.
Thank you all. I think that's a really positive and inspiring place to finish. So just to say a huge thank you to Jo, Djamila and Joanne, and to wish everyone else good luck with introducing new texts that they want to teach in their schools. We'll send round a recording of this session by email so you can share it with your colleagues, and you'll also receive a free sample from the pack and a sort of overview of the text covered. Yeah, thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.